Autumn shadows crept across Evergreen Ridge as four armed drifters approached the secluded farmhouse, their intentions as dark as the gathering dusk above. They couldn't have known that the quiet widow hanging laundry in her yard, her honey blonde, hair tied back with practiced precision, was Katherine Mills, trained by her late husband, the legendary Marine Scout Sniper Master Sergeant James Mills, to hit a target at 800 yards without a second shot. Their fatal mistake was about to become her final lesson. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind whispered through the dying leaves, carrying with it the first hints of winter's approach. Katherine Mills worked methodically in her yard, each movement measured and deliberate as she hung sheets on the line, creating what appeared to be nothing more than a simple domestic scene. To any observer, she would have seemed like just another war widow, trying to maintain her small piece of Montana territory through sheer determination and grit. The four men watching from the tree line saw exactly what they expected to see: vulnerability. Their leader, Marcus Cole, had spent 3 weeks scouting what he thought was the perfect target: an isolated homestead, a lone woman, and enough distance from the nearest town to ensure no one would hear any commotion. His weathered face creased into what passed for a smile, though it carried no warmth. The expression revealed a missing front tooth, lost in one of the many bar fights that had helped build his reputation across 3 states. If you're watching from somewhere peaceful, take a moment to appreciate it, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story about a frontier doctor will show you just how quickly peace can shatter. Behind Cole, his younger brother Thomas nervously adjusted the worn cavalry revolver on his hip, a souvenir from a Union soldier who hadn't survived their last encounter. The remaining 2 members of their gang, the Watson twins, maintained their position with the horses, their matching scarred faces making them look more like gargoyles than brothers. What none of them realized was that Katherine's every movement served a purpose beyond the simple task of hanging laundry. Each sheet she hung created another clear firing lane. Each piece of clothing marked a precise distance she had measured countless times during the long months since James's death. The laundry line itself had been positioned exactly 75 yards from the front porch, the same distance Jim had used to teach her the fundamentals of marksmanship during those first careful lessons. Inside the farmhouse, young Rebecca Turner watched through a window, her hand resting on the Springfield rifle she had learned to clean and maintain under Mrs. Mills's patient instruction. The 16-year-old daughter of Katherine's closest neighbor had found more than just employment helping the widow maintain her property. She had found a mentor who understood that in this unforgiving territory, a woman's survival often depended on skills that proper society preferred not to discuss. Katherine's thoughts drifted to those early days of her marriage, when James had first suggested teaching her to shoot. "The skills that kept me alive through 3 wars," he had told her, cleaning his rifle with practiced precision, "might just keep you alive out here." She had initially resisted, seeing little connection between her life as a farmer's wife and the military precision he had learned as a scout sniper. But James had been patient, teaching her the same fundamentals he had learned through years of service. "Breathing is the key to everything," he would say, adjusting her position as she lay prone on the ridge behind their house. "Inhale, exhale, pause, squeeze, just like I taught my Marines." Day after day, he had drilled her in the basics: range estimation, wind reading, bullet drop compensation. What had started as a husband's concern for his wife's safety had become their shared passion, their private connection to each other. Tell us in the comments if you've ever discovered an unexpected talent, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's tale will show you how hidden skills can change everything. The modified hunting rifle that now rested against the porch rail wasn't the military weapon James had carried through his campaigns, but he had helped her adapt it to her needs. The scope had been carefully calibrated to her eye, the stock adjusted for her shorter frame. More importantly, she had spent countless hours practicing with it, turning his lessons into muscle memory. Katherine could read the signs of approaching trouble as clearly as James had once read wind patterns across a battlefield. The disturbed pattern of bird flights from the western tree line, the unusual silence from the usually vocal meadowlarks, and the subtle track marks she had noticed while hanging her sheets, all pointed to unwelcome visitors trying to remain hidden. What the watching men couldn't see was how her practiced eye constantly scanned her surroundings, using the observation techniques James had drilled into her. They didn't notice how the scattered sheets and clothing created a perfect range card in plain sight, or how her seemingly random movements always kept her within reach of a weapon. They had no way of knowing that every aspect of her homestead had been carefully arranged according to the tactical principles a Marine Scout sniper had spent years perfecting. Marcus Cole had earned his reputation through a combination of cunning and brutality that made even hardened criminals think twice about crossing him. His gang's method was precise: identify isolated homesteads, study the occupants' routines, and strike when the prospect of resistance seemed lowest. The military surplus Spencer carbine, slung across his back, spoke to a history of violence that stretched back to the war, though he had never served in any official capacity. From their concealed position, he studied the widow's movements through a battered brass spyglass, another souvenir from a previous victim. "Looks simple enough," he muttered to his brother Thomas, "just like the Marshall place last month." But something about the woman's movements nagged at his instincts, though he couldn't quite place what. If you're watching from somewhere that knows the price of violence, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will show you how peace comes at an unexpected cost. Thomas Cole shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his stolen cavalry revolver for the 100th time. Unlike his brother, he took no pleasure in their work, but years of following Marcus's lead had burned away whatever conscience he might have once possessed. "She's awful neat about things," he observed, noting the precise spacing of the laundry and the well-maintained state of the property. Behind them, the Watson twins, Luke and Matthew, maintained their watch on the approaches to the homestead. Their matching scars, earned in a prison riot in Tennessee, had given them a fearsome reputation, but those who knew them understood that their true danger lay in their methodical approach to violence. They were Marcus Cole's preferred muscle, precisely because they thought before they acted. What none of them recognized were the telltale signs that would have been immediately apparent to anyone with military experience. The way the woodpile had been stacked to provide both cover and a clear field of fire, how the front porch railings had been reinforced at precise intervals. The subtle markers on fence posts that could help an experienced shooter calculate distance and wind drift. Inside the house, Rebecca Turner maintained her position at the upstairs window, remembering Katherine's lessons about proper observation. "Always watch their hands," Mrs. Mills had taught her, just like Jim taught me. "Hands tell you what a person intends before they act." The girl's fingers rested lightly on the Springfield stock, just as she had been shown. Katherine's awareness of the watching men came not from any direct observation, but from the 100 small details James had trained her to notice. The sudden silence of the jay that usually pestered her cats, the shadow that briefly crossed her carefully positioned mirror in the upper window, the fresh cigarette butt half buried near her property line, its brand unfamiliar to the region. Share in the comments if you've ever noticed something others missed, and make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's tale will test your powers of observation. The Cole gang had developed their reputation across 3 territories through a combination of careful planning and ruthless execution. Marcus had learned from previous mistakes, establishing a pattern that minimized risk while maximizing reward. They would watch a property for days, learning routines, identifying vulnerabilities. Their victims were always isolated, usually women, living alone, chosen specifically because they appeared defenseless. But for all his cunning, Marcus Cole had never encountered someone trained by a Marine Scout sniper. He couldn't know that Katherine's seemingly random domestic activities disguised a precise defensive routine James had helped her develop. Each trip to the well allowed her to check the approaches from the north. Every moment spent in the garden provided cover to study the tree line. The laundry line itself had been positioned to force any approaching threat into carefully predetermined fields of fire. If you're watching from somewhere that values preparation, let us know below and subscribe, because tomorrow's story will show you how planning changes everything. The Watson twins had synchronized their movements with practiced efficiency, maintaining their position while simultaneously covering potential escape routes. They had learned through bitter experience that desperate victims sometimes proved surprisingly resourceful. Luke's hand unconsciously touched the scar on his face, a reminder of underestimating a seemingly helpless target. What they couldn't see was how Katherine's every movement was guided by the same principles James had drilled into her during those long months of training. Economy of motion, he had taught her, demonstrating how to move between firing positions without drawing attention. Every step should have multiple purposes. Now those lessons guided her domestic routine, turning simple chores into opportunities for tactical advantage. Rebecca watched the subtle signs of Mrs. Mills's awareness, marveling at how her mentor could maintain such a convincing appearance of normalcy while preparing for conflict. Katherine had spent months teaching the girl not just about shooting, but about the importance of patience, of reading situations, of understanding how violence often announced itself through silence rather than noise. The autumn wind carried the first hints of approaching winter, rustling through leaves that had begun to turn gold and crimson. To the watching men, the peaceful scene before them suggested nothing more threatening than a widow's quiet struggle to maintain her property. They had no way of knowing they were being assessed with the same precision James Mills had once used to protect his fellow Marines across 3 continents. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Katherine Mills moved with deliberate purpose between the house and the well, each trip carrying more significance than merely fetching water. James had taught her that survival often depended on establishing patterns that seemed ordinary while serving tactical purposes. The wooden bucket she carried had marks carved into its inner rim, carefully positioned to help her gauge distances when held at arm's length, a technique James had adapted from his military range-finding training. If you're watching from somewhere that understands the value of hidden knowledge, let us know in the comments and subscribe, because tomorrow's story will reveal secrets that change everything. The homestead itself had been transformed over the past year, though none of the modifications would appear unusual to casual observation. The front porch's support posts had been repositioned at precise intervals, matching common rifle calibrations. The flower boxes beneath each window contained carefully selected plants, whose movement could help read wind conditions. Even the weather vane atop the barn had been modified with additional markers that only a trained shooter would recognize as wind drift indicators. Rebecca Turner maintained her observation from the upper floor, remembering the lessons that had seemed strange when Mrs. Mills first began teaching her. "Your life might depend on knowing how to read the wind," Katherine had told her, demonstrating how to watch grass movement and dust patterns. "Jim taught his Marines to read nature's warnings. Now I'm teaching you." Inside the house, every window had been carefully measured and marked. though the measurements were disguised as decorative trim. Katherine had spent months practicing dry fire drills from each position, building the muscle memory that James had insisted was crucial. For survival, in a real fight, he had told her, you won't have time to think. Your body needs to know what to do. Share your thoughts if you've ever prepared for something others thought unnecessary. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's tale will show you why preparation matters more than luck. The root cellar beneath the kitchen held more than just preserved vegetables. James had helped her modify it before his last deployment, adding concealed storage spaces and reinforcing key structural points. Always have a fallback position, he had explained, showing her how to create defensive positions that didn't look defensive. The best advantage is the one your opponent doesn't know exists. Katherine's thoughts drifted to those training sessions as she gathered eggs from the hen house, another structure that held hidden purpose. James had designed the building's seemingly random window placement to provide interlocking fields of fire covering the approach from the creek. He had taught her how to use everyday objects as range markers, turning ordinary features of farm life into tactical advantages. The military teaches us to use what's available, he had explained during one lesson, helping her position a rain barrel that would later serve as both water storage and a perfect indication of the 100-yard line. But it also teaches us to create advantages that look natural. Now, those lessons guided every aspect of her property management. Tell us in the comments if you've ever found unexpected uses for ordinary things, and subscribe because tomorrow's story will change how you see the everyday world. The Cole gang's observation continued, though Marcus still couldn't shake the feeling that something about the homestead nagged at his military-trained instincts. The property's layout seemed random at first glance, but there was an underlying order he couldn't quite grasp. If he had served in the military rather than just stealing their weapons and tactics, he might have recognized the deliberate planning behind each seemingly casual feature. Rebecca watched Mrs. Mills continue her chores, marveling at how her mentor could maintain such convincing normalcy while remaining constantly alert. Katherine had spent months teaching the girl not just about shooting, but about the importance of patience, of reading situations, of understanding how violence often announced itself through silence rather than noise. Jim always said that awareness keeps you alive longer than any weapon, Katherine had told her during one of their lessons. Now, watching the subtle signs of approaching threat, Rebecca understood exactly what she had meant. The sudden silence of the farm's usual sounds, the slight shifting of shadows where no shadow should move, the barely perceptible tension in Mrs. Mills's shoulders that told the girl their long hours of preparation might soon be tested. If you're watching from somewhere peaceful, take a moment to appreciate it and subscribe because tomorrow's story will show you how quickly peace can change. Katherine moved between the laundry lines, her movements carefully measured to maintain the appearance of routine while allowing her to scan her surroundings. James had taught her how to use peripheral vision effectively, another skill from his sniper training that proved invaluable in civilian life. Your eyes will catch movement even when your brain hasn't processed it, he had explained. Trust that instinct. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard, each one holding potential significance to a trained observer. Katherine had learned to read these shadows during those long months of training with James, understanding how they could both conceal and reveal movement. The precise arrangement of her clotheslines created a grid pattern in the shadows, turning the yard into a natural range card that only she could read. As the morning progressed, Katherine maintained her deliberate routine while mentally reviewing the defensive plans she and James had developed. Each aspect of the homestead had been carefully considered, from the slight elevation of the front porch that provided a better shooting platform to the seemingly decorative wind chimes that could help calculate wind speed and direction. She had spent countless hours practicing these skills, turning James's military expertise into practical civilian defense. Marcus Cole's decision to approach the homestead came with the same calculated precision that had marked his previous raids. He emerged from the tree line first, affecting the casual stride of a traveler seeking directions. Thomas followed several paces behind, while the Watson twins maintained their position with the horses, providing coverage that would seem innocent to an untrained observer but deadly to anyone who understood tactical positioning. Katherine noticed their approach through the subtle shift in ambient sound, birds falling silent, the wind seeming to hold its breath. James had taught her that nature often provided the first warning of approaching threats. "The world speaks to those who know how to listen," he had said during their training sessions. "The same signs that kept me alive in war can keep you alive here." As the men approached, Katherine continued hanging laundry, though each movement now served a specific purpose. Her position relative to the clothesline kept her within 5 steps of the rifle, concealed behind the oak water barrel. The sheet she was hanging, appearing to flutter randomly in the breeze, actually provided her with perfect concealment while allowing her to track movement through the fabric. Katherine's mind automatically calculated distances and angles just as James had taught her. Marcus Cole was 65 yards out, moving at an angle that would bring him to the front gate in approximately 20 seconds. His brother lagged 12 yards behind, a spacing that suggested military-style training, though their execution lacked the precision that had marked James's teachings. "Fine day for laundry, ma'am," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the forced politeness that Katherine had learned to recognize as prelude to violence. She noted how his right hand stayed close to his Spencer carbine, how his stance shifted subtly to maintain balance despite the uneven ground. "Indeed it is," Katherine replied, her voice carrying the slight tremor expected of a widow addressing strangers. She adjusted her position, seemingly out of nervousness, but actually aligning herself with the pre-measured firing lanes she and James had established. "Though we're expecting rain later, not many travelers come this way so close to winter." Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her observation post, remembering Katherine's instructions about watching hands and eyes rather than faces. The girl's finger rested alongside the Springfield's trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, another of the fundamental safety rules Mrs. Mills had drilled into her. Marcus reached the front gate, his scarred face arranged in what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. "My brother and I have been riding hard," he said, gesturing to Thomas. "Wondered if we might trouble you for some water, maybe rest. Our horse is a spell." His eyes darted around the property, taking in details that might have seemed innocent to most observers. Katherine recognized the tactical assessment in his gaze, though his technique lacked the thoroughness James had insisted upon. She could tell the moment Marcus noticed the barn's reinforced door, saw the slight narrowing of his eyes as he registered the unusual placement of the water barrels. If he had possessed true military training, these details might have warned him. Instead, they merely registered as curious abnormalities. "Of course," Katherine responded, maintaining the role of the helpful widow, while mentally noting how Thomas's position had shifted to cover the space between her and the porch. "The well's fresh drawn. I'll fetch you cups." She moved toward the porch with measured steps, each one placing her in a slightly better tactical position. The Watson twins had begun a slow, casual circle around the property's perimeter. Their movement appearing random, but actually following a standard flanking pattern. Katherine tracked their progress through the subtle vibrations they caused in her carefully positioned wind chimes, another of James's adaptations of military surveillance. Techniques to civilian defense. If you're watching from a place that knows the value of vigilance, you'll understand what comes next. Make sure you're subscribed for tomorrow's story about battlefield wisdom, finding new purpose. Marcus Cole followed Katherine to the porch, maintaining what appeared to be a respectful distance, but was actually optimal range for the Spencer carbine he carried. "That's a fine rifle you have there," he commented, nodding toward the hunting weapon visible through the front window. Not Katherine's actual rifle, but a decoy James had suggested placing in plain sight. "My late husband's," Katherine replied, letting genuine grief color her voice. He believed in being prepared. She didn't mention how James had modified her actual rifle, how he had spent weeks helping her adjust the trigger pull and sight alignment to match her specific needs, how he had taught her to maintain it with the same precision he had learned in the Marines. The tension in the yard built with the steadiness of an approaching storm. Katherine could read the signs of imminent violence in the way Marcus shifted his weight, in how Thomas's hand strayed closer to his stolen cavalry revolver. The Watson twins had completed half their flanking movement, unaware that their position had been compromised by the subtle alerts James had helped her build into the property's perimeter. "Your husband," Marcus said, his forced politeness beginning to crack. He was a military man? Something in the property's layout had finally registered with his instincts, though he couldn't quite identify what triggered his unease. "Marine Scout Sniper," Katherine replied, her voice carrying a pride. She didn't have to fake. "He believed in teaching me everything he knew." Nay. She let the implications of that statement hang in the autumn air, calculating the distance to her concealed rifle while watching how Marcus processed this new information. The moment hung in the autumn air as Marcus Cole processed Katherine's words about her husband's military background. To understand the full weight of that revelation, we must return to the spring of 1870, when James Mills first began teaching his wife the skills that would one day mean the difference between life and death. James had returned from his third deployment, changed not by the horrors he'd witnessed, but by a new understanding of how vulnerable civilians could be. He'd seen too many homesteads ravaged by raiders who targeted those they perceived as defenseless. The skills he'd learned as a Marine Scout sniper, he realized, could protect more than just his fellow soldiers. "The first thing you need to understand," James had told Katherine that spring morning, setting up their first practice target against the barn's eastern wall, "is that precision isn't just about hitting a target. It's about understanding everything that affects the shot." He had positioned her carefully, showing her how to establish a stable shooting position that looked natural, comfortable enough to maintain for hours if necessary. If you're watching from somewhere that understands the value of patience, you'll appreciate what happened next. Subscribe to learn how dedication transforms into survival. Katherine had initially resisted the training, seeing little connection between her life as a farmer's wife and the military precision James insisted upon. But her husband's patience had been infinite, born from years of teaching young Marines the art of precision shooting. "Everything I'm teaching you," he would say, adjusting her grip on the rifle, "is about control. Control your breathing, control your movement, control the situation." The lessons had started simply enough. James taught her the fundamentals of marksmanship, proper breathing techniques, trigger control, sight alignment. But as the weeks progressed, the training evolved into something more comprehensive. He showed her how to read wind patterns across the prairie grass, how to use natural features for range estimation, how to maintain awareness of her surroundings while focusing on a specific task. "In the Marines," he had explained, demonstrating how to use everyday objects for range calculation, "we had sophisticated equipment for measuring distance and wind speed. Out here, we need to adapt those principles to what's available." He taught her to use fence posts as range markers, showing her how to position them at specific intervals that appeared random to others, but provided her with precise distance measurements. Their training sessions had become a daily ritual, weather permitting. Dawn would find them on the ridge behind the house, where James would teach her the same wind-reading techniques he'd used in combat. Afternoons were spent learning how to move efficiently between positions, how to use natural cover effectively, how to maintain awareness while appearing relaxed and vulnerable. The best advantage, James had often said, is the one your opponent doesn't know you have. He helped her develop a system of subtle marks and measurements throughout their property, teaching her how to disguise military precision behind domestic appearance. Every window frame, every fence post, every seemingly decorative feature had been carefully positioned to serve both practical and tactical purposes. Catherine's natural aptitude for marksmanship had surprised them both. James had attributed it to her patience, her attention to detail, qualities that made her an excellent farmer's wife, but also translated perfectly to precision shooting. "You have the same qualities I looked for in my best snipers," he had told her one evening, after she had consistently hit targets at ranges that would have impressed his Marine instructors. The training intensified after James received reports of increasing raider activity in neighboring territories. He began incorporating more advanced techniques, how to engage multiple targets, how to use terrain to channel opponent movement, how to maintain tactical advantage while appearing vulnerable. "In combat," he explained, "we had fire teams and support units. Here, you need to create those advantages through preparation and positioning." Their property had gradually transformed, though few would notice the changes. The barn's reconstruction after a storm had included subtle modifications to provide better firing positions. The new well placement offered perfect coverage of the main approach. Even the flower beds had been arranged to force visitors along, specific paths that could be easily monitored and controlled. James had taught her that survival often depended more on preventing conflict than winning it. "The best snipers I knew," he would say, "could control a situation without firing a shot. Presence, positioning, and preparation often matter more than actual engagement." These lessons had shaped every aspect of how Katherine maintained their homestead. The last lesson James had given her, just days before departing for what would be his final deployment, had focused on something beyond marksmanship. "The hardest part," he had told her, cleaning his rifle with characteristic precision, "isn't pulling the trigger. It's living with the responsibility that comes with having these skills. Use them to protect, to prevent harm, to maintain peace, if possible. But when peace fails, don't hesitate." Now, as Marcus Cole stood at her gate, unwittingly testing those lessons, Katherine felt the weight of James's training in every breath, every movement, every careful calculation. Her husband had prepared her not just to survive, but to protect everything they had built together. The skills of a Marine Scout sniper adapted for civilian defense were about to be tested against those who mistook preparation for vulnerability. The revelation of James's military background had shifted the atmosphere in the yard, though Marcus Cole wasn't experienced enough to understand exactly how. His instincts, honed through years of selecting vulnerable targets, warned him that something about this situation had changed, but his confidence in superior numbers overwhelmed his caution. "Marine Scout Sniper," he repeated, his forced smile slipping slightly. "Interesting. Must have been quite a man." His hand moved closer to his Spencer carbine, a movement that Katherine tracked with the same precision James had taught her to use when calculating wind drift. Katherine maintained her position on the porch, each subtle movement placing her exactly where she needed to be. "He was," she replied, her voice carrying genuine pride. "Taught me everything he knew about reading distances." Her eyes flicked briefly to the Watson twins, now precisely 78 yards out, exactly where the second fence post's shadow crossed the east pasture line. If you're fascinated by the science of precision, subscribe for tomorrow's story about a frontier doctor's incredible accuracy. Marcus took another step forward, crossing the invisible line Katherine had marked, using the shadow of her carefully positioned rain barrel. "Reading distances," he said, his tone shifting from false politeness to something darker. "Useful skill for a widow living alone." Katherine's response came in the form of action rather than words. In one fluid motion, she stepped back and swept her apron aside, revealing the modified rifle that had been concealed behind the porch post. Before Marcus could bring his Spencer to bear, her first shot struck the ground precisely 6 inches, in front of his feet, kicking up dirt with surgical accuracy. "That shot," she said calmly, the rifle already repositioned for a follow-up, "was at exactly 23 yards. The next one won't be a warning." Her voice carried the same steady certainty James had taught her to maintain during qualification. "Shoots." Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her position, remembering Mrs. Mills's lessons about supporting fire. The girls Springfield remained trained on Thomas Cole, whose stolen cavalry revolver had frozen halfway out of its holster. The Watson twins reacted with the coordinated movement that had made them feared across 3 territories. But Katherine had anticipated this. Her second shot caught the ground between them with precision that spoke of countless hours of practice, freezing them in place 78 yards from where James had helped her zero her rifle for exactly this range. "Luke and Matthew Watson," Katherine called out, her voice carrying clearly across the measured distance. "Your current position is well within the range where my husband taught me to place shots within an inch of my aim point. The twins matching." Scarred faces showed the first traces of genuine fear as they realized their flanking maneuver had been predicted and countered. Marcus Cole's facade of politeness vanished entirely, replaced by the cold calculation that had made him notorious. "4 against 1, Mrs. Mills," he snarled, though he didn't dare move from his position. "Those aren't odds that favor you." Katherine's laugh carried the same confidence James had instilled during their long hours of training. "Precision shooting isn't about odds," she replied, smoothly adjusting her position to maintain coverage of all 4 men. "It's about mathematics, distance, wind speed, bullet drop. Everything can be calculated if you know how." To demonstrate her point, she fired again, this time placing a shot that cut through Thomas Cole's hat brim without touching a hair on his head. The younger Cole brother stumbled backward, his face pale with shock at the display of marksmanship that would have impressed even veteran military instructors. "That shot," Katherine continued, her voice carrying the teaching tone James had used with his Marines, "had to account for a 7-mile-per-hour crosswind. Would you like me to demonstrate what I can do in calm conditions?" The Watson twins had begun a slow retreat toward their horses, their usual coordination hampered by the realization that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience. Katherine tracked their movement through her peripheral vision, just as James had taught her to maintain awareness of multiple targets. "Your Spencer carbine," she addressed Marcus, who had remained frozen in place, "has an effective range of about 200 yards in experienced hands, which you're not, based on how you're holding it." Her assessment carried the same clinical precision James had used when evaluating new recruits. "The modifications my husband helped me make to this rifle let me place accurate shots at 400 yards. Would you like to test the difference?" Rebecca watched in amazement as the feared Cole gang found themselves systematically stripped of their confidence by a woman who spoke about tactical advantage with the authority of a military instructor. Each of Mrs. Mills's shots had demonstrated not just accuracy, but a deeper understanding of combat principles that James had drilled into her over countless hours of practice. "I'll make this simple," Katherine announced, her rifle remaining rock-steady despite the extended engagement. "My husband taught me that the best victories are the ones that end without bloodshed." You have exactly 30 seconds to mount up and ride out. After that, I start demonstrating the difference between warning shots and killing shots." The absolute certainty in her voice, backed by the demonstrated precision of her marksmanship, carried more weight than any threat of violence. Marcus Cole, for the first time in his criminal career, found himself facing someone whose capabilities he couldn't override with brute force or superior numbers. Marcus Cole's hand tightened on his Spencer carbine, his mind racing to reconcile the vulnerable widow he'd expected with the precision shooter he now faced. To understand the full weight of this moment, we need to return to the day that had transformed Katherine's training from theoretical preparation to harsh necessity. It had been 6 months after James's death when the first real threat had presented itself. 2 drifters, thinking they'd found easy prey, had approached her homestead with the same predatory confidence the Cole gang now displayed. That day had tested everything James had taught her, proving that his lessons weren't just exercises, they were survival skills. "The hardest part isn't pulling the trigger," James had told her during one of their final training sessions. "It's maintaining control when your heart's pounding and your hands want to shake." Katherine had demonstrated that control that day, placing warning shots with such precision that the drifters had fled, spreading words of caution about the widow who shot like a military marksman. If you're watching from somewhere that knows the weight of responsibility, subscribe, because tomorrow's story will show you how preparation meets purpose. Now, as she kept her rifle trained on Marcus Cole, Katherine remembered James's lessons about controlling multiple threats. The Watson twins had begun inching toward their horses, their movements betraying their growing unease. Thomas Cole's hand still hovered near his stolen cavalry revolver, though the precise shot through his hat brim had shaken his confidence considerably. "You know what my husband taught me about trigger discipline?" Katherine called out, her voice carrying the same instructional tone James had used during their lessons. "He said the difference between a warning and a kill shot isn't in the aim, it's in the decision." Her rifle remained perfectly steady, demonstrating the stance stability James had drilled into her through countless hours of practice. Inside the house, Rebecca watched the unfolding scene with growing understanding. She remembered Mrs. Mills's lessons about tactical patience, about how controlling a situation often meant controlling yourself first. The girls Springfield remained trained on her assigned sector, just as she'd been taught. Katherine's mind flashed back to the long discussions she'd had with James about the responsibility that came with their training. "Every shot you take carries weight," he'd explained, cleaning his rifle with characteristic precision. "Not just the physical impact, but the message it sends." Now, each carefully placed warning shot communicated clearly to the Cole gang that they faced someone with professional military training. "Let me tell you about something else Jim taught me," Katherine continued, using his lessons to maintain psychological control of the situation. "He said the military teaches 3 levels of awareness. Right now, you're at the first level. You know you're in danger, but you haven't accepted how complete your disadvantage is." Marcus Cole's scarred face twitched at her words. The casual confidence that had marked his approach had been replaced by the wary calculation of a predator realizing it had wandered into another predator's territory. "Fancy shooting doesn't change the numbers," he growled, though he remained frozen in place. "Numbers," Katherine replied, smoothly adjusting her position to maintain coverage of all 4 men, "were something else Jim taught me about. In combat, he said, superior numbers only matter if you can bring them to bear effectively. Right now, you're spread out exactly how I want you, at ranges I've practiced daily for the past 3 years. The autumn wind picked up, carrying with it the memory of James's voice, explaining wind calls and drift compensation. Katherine automatically adjusted her aim to account for the conditions, another habit drilled into her through repetition. "See how the grass is moving?" she had asked Rebecca during their lessons. "That's nature's rangefinder, just like Jim taught me." Wutu. The Watson twins exchanged glances, their usual coordination now hampered by the growing realization that they faced someone with capabilities beyond their experience. Their reputation had been built on overwhelming force against unprepared victims. Nothing in their experience had prepared them for a widow who discussed tactical advantage with military precision. "You're probably wondering," Katherine continued, maintaining the psychological pressure James had taught her was often more effective than physical threats, "why I let you get this close before revealing my capabilities." Her rifle tracked Marcus's subtle weight shift with smooth precision. That was another of Jim's lessons, controlling where and when the confrontation happens. The memory of that lesson rose clearly in her mind. James had set up multiple targets at various ranges, teaching her how to manage engagement distances effectively. "In the Marines," he'd explained, "we learned that choosing your ground is often more important than raw shooting skill." Rebecca watched Mrs. Mills maintain absolute control of the situation, understanding now why they had spent so many hours practicing communication and coordination. Each position they occupied had been carefully planned and repeatedly drilled, turning theoretical defense into practical advantage. "My husband," Katherine announced, her voice carrying across the yard with parade ground clarity, "spent 15 years as a Marine Scout sniper, teaching others how to protect themselves and their units. He spent our last 3 years together, teaching me everything he knew." She let that sink in, watching how the Cole gang processed this information. "I'm not just some widow with a rifle. I'm his last student, and I practice every single day." Marcus Cole's experience with violence had taught him to recognize shifting tactical situations, even if he lacked formal military training. The confident, a predator who had approached the homestead minutes earlier, now found himself reassessing everything about his position. His eyes darted between the precise shot patterns Katherine had demonstrated, noting how each impact marked a carefully measured distance. Katherine maintained her rifle's position with the same steady precision James had drilled into her through countless hours of practice. Every aspect of her stance reflected military training adapted for practical defense. Her breathing remained controlled, her grip remained firm but relaxed, her sight picture remained clear and consistent. "I want you to look at something," she said, her voice carrying the same instructional tone James had used during their training sessions. "See those fence posts along the eastern approach? Notice anything about their spacing?" She watched recognition dawn in Marcus's eyes as he finally noticed the mathematical precision in what had appeared to be random placement. The Watson twins had instinctively begun to separate, attempting to create multiple threats, but Katherine's next shot froze them in place. The bullet struck the ground exactly halfway between them, demonstrating an awareness of their tactical movement that spoke of military-grade observation skills. "That's called target tracking," Katherine explained, maintaining psychological dominance through technical expertise. "Jim spent weeks teaching me how to manage multiple threats effectively. Would you like me to demonstrate the difference between tracking and engaging?" Her rifle shifted slightly, emphasizing the threat without requiring additional shots. Inside the house, Rebecca had positioned herself exactly as Mrs. Mills had taught her, understanding now why they had spent so many hours practicing coordination between firing positions. The girl's Springfield covered the prescribed arc of fire, preventing any attempt to rush the house from the western approach. Katherine's mind remained clear, focused on implementing the defensive plans she and James had developed through long hours of discussion and practice. Every feature of the homestead that had seemed decorative now revealed its tactical purpose. The newly planted oak saplings that marked precise ranges, the garden rows that channeled movement along predictable paths. the wind chimes that provided audio cues for distance and direction. "Your brother's getting nervous, Marcus," Katherine observed, noting Thomas's increasingly unstable grip on his stolen cavalry revolver. "That's something else Jim taught me about. Stress indicators in combat situations. Right now, your whole team is showing classic signs of tactical deterioration." Marcus maintained his outward calm, though Katherine could read the tension in his trigger finger, the slight shift in his weight that betrayed preparation for sudden movement. "Fancy, words don't change the situation," he growled, trying to regain psychological control. "You can't watch all of us forever." Katherine's response came in the form of another demonstration. Without shifting her primary aim from Marcus, she fired a shot that knocked the tobacco tin from Luke Watson's hand just as he reached for it. A display of peripheral awareness and marksmanship that would have impressed even James's fellow Marine instructors. "Actually," she replied, her rifle already back on target, "maintaining awareness while engaging multiple threats was something Jim insisted I master. We spent months practicing what he called situation control, using precision fire to manipulate opponent positioning." To emphasize her point, she placed another shot that created a perfect diagonal line with her previous impacts, demonstrating both accuracy and tactical planning. The message was clear. Every shot served a specific purpose. Every position had been calculated, every movement anticipated. "Your current positions," Katherine continued, her voice carrying the same steady authority James had used when instructing new recruits, "were chosen the moment you approached the property. The fence line you're using for cover? Jim helped me position it specifically to channel threats into predictable positions. The seemingly random objects in the yard, range markers, every one of them measured and verified." The Watson twins exchanged glances, their usual coordination now hampered by the growing realization that their standard tactics were worse than useless. They had walked into a carefully prepared defensive position, guided there by military-grade tactical planning. Inside the house, Rebecca remembered Mrs. Mills's lessons about patience in defensive positions. "Jim always said that controlling a situation isn't just about shooting," Katherine had told her during their training. "It's about making your opponents realize that their best option is to withdraw." The autumn sun had reached its zenith, eliminating shadows that might have provided concealment for sudden movement. Katherine had intentionally scheduled her laundry tasks for this time of day. Another example of James's teaching about controlling environmental factors in tactical situations. "I'm going to explain something," Katherine announced, maintaining her precise aim on Marcus while remaining aware of the others' positions. "Every morning, I spend 2 hours practicing the skills Jim taught me. Range estimation, wind reading, target acquisition and tracking. The Marine Corps taught him that proficiency requires consistent drilling, and he taught that to me." The Cole Gang's reputation had been built on careful target selection and overwhelming force. Now, they found themselves facing someone whose preparation and training exceeded anything they had encountered. Their usual advantages, superior numbers, intimidation, the element of surprise, had been systematically negated by military-grade tactical planning. The tense standoff was suddenly interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats from the western road. Katherine's trained ear recognized the precise rhythm of military-trained horsemanship, something she had learned to identify during her lessons with James. A rider emerged from the tree line, his bearing and posture immediately marking him as different from the Cole Gang. "Well now," the newcomer called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command experience. "This is an interesting situation." He sat astride his horse with the easy confidence of a cavalry veteran, though he wore civilian clothes. The Spencer carbine slung across his back was properly maintained, unlike Marcus Cole's stolen weapon. Katherine maintained her firing position, but her mind raced to process this new tactical challenge. The rider's approach had purposefully placed him at an angle that complicated her firing solutions, a position that suggested formal military training. "Lieutenant Samuel Hayes," the man announced, touching the brim of his hat. "Or at least I was, during the war. Served with your husband in '63, Mrs. Mills." His eyes scanned the property with professional assessment, noting the precise placement of defensive positions. Jim always did have a talent for tactical preparation. Inside the house, Rebecca felt a new tension in the air. This wasn't like the crude threat posed by the Cole gang. The girl could sense that Mrs. Mills was recalculating everything, just as she'd been taught to do when situations changed unexpectedly. "Jim mentioned you," Katherine replied, her rifle remaining steadily positioned. "Said you were one of the best marksmen in the regiment. Also said you were killed at Gettysburg." The last part carried a clear question, one that made Marcus Cole's head snap up with sudden interest. Hayes's laugh carried no humor. "Reports of death can be useful in our line of work. Something your husband understood well." He shifted slightly in his saddle, maintaining his tactically advantageous position. Course, Jim's death was real enough. Shame about that ambush in Montana. Katherine's breath caught slightly, though. Her rifle never wavered. The official report had listed James's death as a training accident. Very few people knew the truth about the ambush that had taken her husband's life. "These men work for you," she stated rather than asked, reading the subtle signs of coordination she had been trained to notice. The Cole gang's positioning suddenly made more sense. Their approach had been too precise for common bandits. "Smart, just like Jim said," Hayes nodded. "Been watching your property for weeks. Had to know if you were really as well-trained as the rumors claimed." His expression hardened. "Those documents your husband was carrying when he died. We need them." The Watson twins moved with new purpose, their previous uncertainty replaced by professional focus. They had been playing the role of common criminals, but their movements now revealed military training beneath the rough exterior. "The Cole brothers might be genuine opportunists," Katherine assessed, demonstrating the tactical awareness James had instilled in her, "but the twins are former military, probably cavalry, based on their riding style. You've been using this gang as cover for your real operations." Hayes smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Jim taught you well. Too well, maybe. Those documents could cause a lot of problems for certain people who've worked hard to establish themselves out here. People who don't want their wartime activities examined too closely." Katherine's mind raced through the implications. James had never told her the exact contents of the documents he protected, only that they contained evidence of war crimes that could topple several now prominent territorial officials. His determination to preserve that evidence had cost him his life. "The Homestead raids," she realized aloud. "They're not random. You're searching for the documents, using the Cole gang as cover for military precision operations." The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. The increasing raids in the territory, the pattern of searched properties, the missing papers from ransacked homes, all part of a systematic search. "Smart woman," Hayes nodded. "Jim always said you had a tactical mind. Where you've set up this property proves it. Those documents, though, they're better left buried in the past, along with all the other ugly secrets from the war." Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her position, but her young mind was putting pieces together as well. All those extra lessons Mrs. Mills had given her about document handling and secure storage suddenly carried new meaning. "Interesting thing about Marine Scout snipers," Katherine said, her voice carrying the same steady calm James had taught her to maintain under pressure. "They understand the importance of redundancy, backup plans, multiple locations." She saw Hayes's expression shift slightly, recognizing the implication. The entire tactical situation had transformed. What had appeared to be a simple confrontation with opportunistic criminals had revealed itself as something far more complex. Katherine's training hadn't just prepared her to defend against random raiders. It had prepared her to protect information that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. Lieutenant Hayes's revelation had transformed the tactical situation entirely, but Katherine's rifle remained steady, her breathing controlled just as James had taught her. To understand the full weight of this moment, we need to return to the last conversation she had with her husband before his fatal mission. "If anything happens to me," James had told her that morning, methodically checking his equipment with military precision, "remember everything I taught you about defensive positions. Some secrets are worth protecting, no matter the cost." At the time, she hadn't fully understood the significance of his words. "Those documents you're looking for," Katherine addressed Hayes, maintaining her tactical advantage through careful positioning. "They're not just about war crimes, are they? They're about how certain officers use the chaos of war to build their power out here." Her mind connected details James had shared over years of training sessions. Hayes shifted slightly in his saddle, but his military bearing remained perfect. "War creates opportunities, Mrs. Mills. Some men took advantage of the confusion to acquire land, wealth, position. Your husband's evidence could unravel 15 years of carefully constructed respectability." The Watson twins had taken up new positions, their movements now displaying the tactical precision that revealed their military background. Their act as common criminals had been convincing precisely because it incorporated their actual combat experience. "3rd Cavalry," Katherine stated, noting their distinctive movement patterns. "James showed me how different units moved during our training, said it was crucial to recognize military bearing even when disguised." She saw the slight tension in their shoulders that confirmed her assessment. Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her position, remembering Mrs. Mills's lessons about staying focused during extended confrontations. The girl's young mind worked to process how their daily training sessions had prepared them for this moment. "Your husband was a good Marine," Hayes continued, his voice carrying genuine respect beneath its threat. "But he was an idealist. Thought the war's end meant we could return to simple right and wrong. Some of us understood that peace requires compromises." Katherine's mind flashed to the careful instructions James had given her about document security, the hidden compartments, the multiple locations, the coded messages in seemingly innocent letters, all part of a larger strategy she was only now fully understanding. "The raids on homesteads," she said, demonstrating the tactical analysis James had taught her, "they follow a pattern, working out from the last place James was seen alive, searching every property that might have been a drop point." She saw Hayes's expression confirm her deduction. Marcus Cole, still frozen in place by Katherine's precise shot placement, finally spoke up. "We were just supposed to search the place," he growled. No one said anything about military documents or war crimes. His brother Thomas nodded nervously, their confidence shaken by the revelation that they were pawns in a larger game. "That's why you used local criminals," Katherine continued, "maintaining psychological pressure through demonstrated understanding. Cover your military precision with apparent random violence. Hide systematic searches behind simple robbery." She saw the Watson twins exchange glances, acknowledging her insight. Hayes's laugh carried no warmth. "Jim taught you more than just shooting, I see. He always said understanding tactical patterns was as important as marksmanship." His hand rested casually near his holster, but Katherine noted the practiced ease that masked deadly capability. "He taught me that every defense needs layers," she replied, her rifle remaining rock-steady. "Physical security, tactical positioning, and information control. The documents you're looking for, They're not here, haven't been since the day he died. She saw the subtle tension in Hayes's posture at this revelation. The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and Katherine automatically calculated the weather's effect on visibility and shooting conditions, just as James had drilled into her. Every lesson he had taught her was proving relevant, in ways she hadn't imagined during their training. Those papers document more than just war crimes, she continued, watching Hayes's reaction. They show how certain officers coordinated with raiders during the war, using the chaos to seize property, how they established legitimate ownership afterward, how they've been using that same network to maintain control of the territory. Hayes's expression hardened. Reconstruction required stability. We provided that stability. The territory needed strong leadership, men who understood that peace sometimes requires forceful measures. His justification carried the weight of long practice. And now those same men hold high offices, Katherine concluded, their wartime activities buried under years of respectability. Except James kept records, didn't he? Maintained evidence of how that stability was really achieved. The Watson twins moved with renewed purpose, their positions creating interlocking fields of fire that demonstrated their military training. The Cole brothers, by contrast, looked increasingly uncertain as they realized they were caught in a conflict far beyond simple robbery. "Last chance, Mrs. Mills," Hayes announced, his tone shifting to command authority. "Tell us where the documents are, and this ends peacefully. Continue protecting them, and we'll have to demonstrate why some secrets are best left buried." The tension in the yard crystallized as a new sound carried across the autumn air, the distant but distinct ring of the church bell in Carson's Creek. To most ears, it would have seemed nothing more than the regular marking of the hour, but Katherine recognized the specific pattern James had helped her establish with the town's veterans months ago. "Interesting thing about military training," Katherine said, her rifle remaining perfectly steady. "It teaches you the value of force multiplication. Jim didn't just train me, he helped me establish a network." She saw the subtle shift in Hayes's posture as he processed this information. From the tree line emerged several figures moving with the unmistakable precision of military experience. Daniel Walker, who'd served as a cavalry scout during the war, took up a position that perfectly covered the Watson twins' left flank. Thomas Chen, whose experience as an army sharpshooter had earned him commendations, appeared on the opposite side, effectively cutting off any retreat. Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her position, but felt a surge of understanding. The weekly shooting practices Mrs. Mills had organized for local veterans hadn't just been about maintaining skills. They had been preparation for this kind of coordinated defense. "Your husband," Hayes observed, his tactical assessment evident. In his tone, he wasn't just teaching you, he was building a response force. The professional respect in his voice carried an edge of concern. Katherine's mind flashed to those careful planning sessions with the local veterans. James had helped her understand that true security came not from individual skill, but from coordinated response. Each man who now emerged had been carefully selected and trained, their positions practiced until they could move as one unit. 4. More veterans just took up positions along your escape route, Katherine informed Hayes, demonstrating the tactical awareness James had drilled into her. All former military, all maintaining their marksmanship skills, all understanding exactly what's at stake here. The Watson twins' military training showed in how quickly they assessed the deteriorating tactical situation. Their positions, while still professionally maintained, had shifted from offensive to defensive, as they recognized the expertise of those now surrounding them. "Marcus," Katherine addressed the Cole gang leader, "you're probably realizing that you've been used as cover for something far bigger than simple robbery. The question is whether you want to stay caught in the middle of it." She saw the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. From the direction of the old miller's house came the distinctive crack of a Springfield rifle, a precise warning shot that kicked up dirt exactly where Hayes had been subtly trying to maneuver his horse. Katherine recognized Jacob Miller's marksmanship, the old army sergeant's shot placement as precise as ever. "That's what Jim really taught me," Katherine continued, maintaining psychological pressure through demonstrated preparation. Not just how to shoot, but how to build something larger, a community of defenders, each understanding their role, each maintaining their skills. Hayes's military experience showed in how quickly he assessed the changed tactical situation. What had seemed like an isolated homestead had revealed itself as the center of a carefully prepared defensive network. The local veterans, who had appeared to be nothing more than peaceful settlers, now demonstrated the coordinated response of a trained military unit. "Weekly shooting competitions," Katherine explained, seeing the recognition in Hayes's eyes. "Regular training sessions disguised as social gatherings. Jim helped me establish it all before he died, knowing that someday men like you would come looking for what he protected." The Watson twins exchanged glances that carried years of military communication. Their experience told them they now faced not just a trained widow, but a coordinated force of combat veterans who understood tactical positioning and coordinated response. "You're surrounded by men who understand exactly what those documents represent," Katherine continued. "Veterans who've seen how power can be abused, who chose to stand for something different when they came home. Jim didn't just leave me his evidence, he left me his network of trusted allies." Thomas Cole, his stolen cavalry revolver now seeming inadequate against trained military opposition, spoke up nervously. "Marcus, this ain't what we signed up for. These ain't regular homesteaders." His brother's face showed similar concern as they realized the full scope of their situation. More figures emerged from carefully prepared positions. Patrick O'Brien, whose experience as a combat engineer had helped design the homestead's defensive layout. Samuel Rodriguez, whose time as a cavalry scout made him lethal at long range. Michael Thompson, whose artillery experience translated perfectly to coordinated fire control. "Last warning, Lieutenant Hayes," Katherine announced, her voice carrying the same command authority James had used with his Marines. "You're facing 13 combat veterans, all maintaining their skills, all understanding exactly what's at stake. Your tactical position is compromised, your cover force is unraveling, and your mission is exposed." Lieutenant Hayes's military experience revealed itself in his immediate response to the changed tactical situation. With the fluid precision of a combat veteran, he shifted his horse's position to minimize exposure while maintaining command presence, his movements suggesting years of cavalry expertise. "Impressive deployment," he acknowledged, his voice carrying genuine professional respect. "But you've revealed your full strength too early. A tactical error Jim wouldn't have approved of." Katherine recognized the subtle hand signal Hayes directed toward the Watson twins, standard cavalry code that James had taught her to recognize during their long training sessions. The former soldiers responded instantly, their movements suggesting they were about to implement a practiced maneuver that had likely served them well during the war. "Daniel," Katherine called out calmly, addressing the former cavalry scout, "they're setting up for a split-force flanking action. Standard 3rd Cavalry technique from 63. Watch for the secondary movement on your left." Her voice carried the same instructional tone James had used during their training sessions, steady and confident despite the escalating tension. From his position behind the reinforced woodpile, Daniel Walker responded with immediate understanding, adjusting his coverage to counter the anticipated movement. His Springfield rifle, maintained with military precision, tracked the Watson twins with practiced ease. The other veterans similarly shifted their positions, demonstrating the unit cohesion that regular training had developed over months of preparation. "You see, Lieutenant," Katherine continued, her rifle remaining rock-steady on Hayes's position, Jim didn't just teach me shooting. He made sure I understood unit tactics, command signals, standard military maneuvers. Everything. You might try, we've practiced countering. He called it comprehensive tactical preparation. Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her assigned position, but now understood why Mrs. Mills had insisted she learn to recognize military hand signals and unit movements. The girl's role wasn't just about providing covering fire. It was about being part of a coordinated defense system that James had designed and Katherine had perfected. Hayes's next move demonstrated why he had risen to command during the war. With a speed that belied his casual posture, he drew and fired in one fluid motion. The shot was precise, striking the corner post of Katherine's porch exactly where he intended, a demonstration of his own considerable skill and a warning of what was to come. Katherine's response was immediate but measured, exactly as James had trained her. Her return shot caught Hayes's hat brim, matching his demonstration of precision while maintaining the implicit threat. The bullet passed close enough to stir his hair, but didn't draw blood, a level of control that spoke of countless hours of practice. That fast draw technique, she commented, her rifle already back in position. Standard officer training from Fort Benning. Jim showed me the counter after he saw it used in Georgia. Said it was flashy but predictable. The Watson twins initiated their flanking movement with the smooth coordination of longtime military partners. Their boots barely made a sound on the hard-packed earth as they executed a textbook cavalry maneuver. But Katherine's defenders responded with equally practiced precision, each veteran adjusting their position to maintain interlocking fields of fire, just as they had rehearsed dozens of times. "Thomas," Katherine called to Chen. "Pattern 3. The former Army sharpshooter immediately understood, firing a series of precisely placed shots that forced the twins to move exactly where the defenders wanted them. Each impact kicked up dirt in a calculated pattern, herding the experienced soldiers like cattle in a pen. Marcus Cole, watching the exchange of military expertise with growing concern, made a desperate play. He brought his Spencer carbine up in a swift motion, but before he could level it properly, 3 different shots struck the ground around him in a perfect triangle pattern. A demonstration of coordinated fire that would have impressed any military instructor. "That's called synchronized fire," Katherine explained, her voice remaining calm despite the intensity of the moment. "Another technique Jim taught us. Notice how each shot came from a different defender, but landed exactly where intended. That takes practice. We do this twice a week, working on timing and coordination until it becomes instinct." Hayes's tactical assessment was visible in his expression as he watched his carefully planned operation unravel. What had seemed like a straightforward mission against an isolated widow had revealed itself as a confrontation with a well-trained defensive unit. Every standard military tactic he might employ had already been anticipated and prepared for through countless hours of dedicated practice. "Your men are good," Katherine acknowledged, maintaining both tactical and psychological pressure. "But we've been preparing for this specific scenario for months. Every member of this defense force knows their role, their positions, their responsibilities." Jim called it tactical inevitability, creating a situation where every possible enemy action has already been planned for and countered. The autumn wind carried the smell of gun smoke as more shots were exchanged, each one carefully placed, each demonstrating the level of training on both sides. The Watson twins attempted another standard cavalry maneuver, only to find it countered by defenders who had practiced against exactly such movements. Their responses honed through repetition until they became reflexive. "Michael," Katherine called out to the former artillery sergeant, "time to demonstrate that modified signal system." Thompson immediately produced a series of sharp whistle blasts, complex signals that coordinated the defenders' movements without revealing their intentions to the opposition. The system, adapted from artillery coordination protocols, allowed Katherine's forces to communicate and respond as a single unit. Hayes recognized the adaptation of military communications, his expression showing professional appreciation despite his increasingly precarious position. Using artillery coordination signals for infantry movement, he observed, respect mixing with growing concern. Your husband always did have a talent for adapting standard procedures to new situations. I see he taught you well. The Cole brothers, increasingly aware that they were caught between two trained military forces, began showing signs of psychological breakdown. Thomas's hand shook visibly on his stolen cavalry revolver, while Marcus's confident expression had been replaced by the desperate calculation of a man realizing he was hopelessly outmatched in a game he hadn't known he was playing. The tactical situation continued to evolve as Hayes assessed his deteriorating position. His military training showed in how he processed each new revelation, each layer of Katherine's preparation that became apparent. The Homestead's defensive network had proved far more sophisticated than initial intelligence had suggested. "You know what Jim always said about tactical depth?" Katherine called out, maintaining psychological pressure while her rifle remained steady. He said the best defense isn't just about having multiple layers. It's about making your opponent question how many more layers they haven't discovered yet. As if to emphasize her point, a series of precisely placed shots from multiple defenders forced the Watson twins to abandon their flanking attempt. The former cavalrymen found themselves channeled into a position that Katherine's forces had clearly prepared for. Their military expertise turned against them through careful planning. "Notice the pattern in the fence posts," she continued, her voice carrying the same instructional tone James had used. "How they seem randomly spaced, but actually create perfect triangulation points for coordinated fire. Jim spent weeks helping me calculate those positions. Said proper preparation eliminates the need for luck." Hayes's tactical eye narrowed as he finally recognized the full scope of the property's defensive design. Every feature that had appeared rustic or random now revealed its military purpose. The apparently decorative weather vane that actually provided wind readings at multiple elevations, the series of rain barrels positioned to create standardized range markers, even the pattern of newly planted trees that subtly forced approaching threats into predetermined fields of fire. "Samuel," Katherine called to Rodriguez, the former cavalry scout, "show them why we spent 3 days adjusting that new fence line." The veteran responded immediately, firing a shot that ricocheted off a carefully angled post, striking the ground behind one of the Watson twins' positions. The demonstration of calculated geometry in action made Hayes curse under his breath. Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her position, but understood now why Mrs. Mills had insisted she learn the mathematical principles behind indirect fire. The girl had spent hours practicing with the older woman, learning how angles and surfaces could turn the entire property into a calculated shooting gallery. "That ricochet technique," Hayes observed, professional appreciation mixing with growing concern. 3rd Marines used it in the Peninsula campaign. Jim was always good at adapting battlefield innovations for practical use. His hand remained near his weapon, but his tactical assessment had clearly shifted from offense to defense. Katherine's mind flashed to the long evenings spent with James, calculating angles and trajectories, turning military ballistics into practical defensive measures. "He taught me that every surface can serve multiple purposes," she replied. "A fence post can be a range marker, a ricochet point, and cover, all while looking like simple property maintenance." The Watson twins attempted to coordinate another movement, their military training evident in their precision, but Katherine's defenders had prepared for standard cavalry tactics. Multiple shots from different positions forced them apart, demonstrating how thoroughly James's training had prepared this civilian force to counter military doctrine. Marcus Cole, watching his supposedly superior force being systematically outmaneuvered, made another desperate attempt to regain tactical advantage. His move toward better cover was met with a precise shot from Katherine that splintered the ground at his feet, forcing him back into a position that offered only the cover her forces allowed. "Michael," Katherine addressed the former artillery. "Sergeant, time to demonstrate the full signal system." Thompson's next series of whistle blasts carried a more complex pattern, coordinating the defenders' movements in ways that spoke of countless hours of practice. The veteran force responded as a single unit, shifting positions with military precision while maintaining perfect fire coverage. "Implementing artillery coordination protocols for small unit tactics," Hayes noted, his tactical mind recognizing the adaptation, creating a civilian response force capable of military-grade coordination. Jim always did think beyond standard doctrine. The autumn sun had reached a position that Katherine's forces had clearly prepared for, its angle creating harsh shadows that worked against any attempt to approach the homestead unobserved. Even the natural light had been incorporated into the defensive planning, another layer of tactical consideration that spoke of thorough military preparation. "You're probably wondering about the documents," Katherine said, maintaining both tactical and psychological pressure. "Wondering if they're hidden somewhere on the property, if this defense is about protecting their location." She saw Hayes's subtle shift in posture that confirmed her assessment. That's exactly the kind of thinking Jim anticipated. Why he made sure this wasn't just about protecting papers, it's about defending something larger. Thomas Cole, his borrowed cavalry, revolver now seeming woefully inadequate, spoke up with growing desperation. "Marcus, there's something wrong here. These ain't just farmers with guns. This is military-grade opposition." His brother's face showed similar recognition of their tactical disadvantage. "You're right," Katherine confirmed, her rifle never wavering. "Every person defending this position has military experience. Every feature of this property has been calculated for defensive advantage. Every response you've seen has been practiced until it became instinct." Jim made sure we were ready not just for random raiders, but for experienced military opposition. Lieutenant Hayes shifted his position slightly, his military training evident in how he maintained tactical advantage even while preparing to speak. "You know, I was there the day Jim started gathering those documents," he said, his voice carrying the weight of shared history. "Watched him realize that something wasn't right about how certain officers were handling civilian property seizures." Katherine's rifle remained steady, but her mind flashed back to late-night conversations with James, his voice low and intense as he explained why their training had to be so thorough. "He knew the risks," she replied, her tone matching Hayes's gravity, "knew that someday men like you would come looking for what he protected." The Watson twins maintained their positions with professional discipline, but their expressions showed growing understanding of the deeper conflict they'd been drawn into. This wasn't just about documents or territory. It was about the corruption that had taken root during the chaos of war. "Jim was an idealist," Hayes continued, his tactical assessment never ceasing, even as he spoke. "Thought that exposing the truth would somehow make things right. Didn't understand that the peace we built out here requires compromise." His hand remained near his weapon, but Katherine noted the subtle signs of tension in his trigger finger. Inside the house, Rebecca remembered the careful lessons Mrs. Mills had given her about document handling and security. The girl now understood why they'd spent so many hours practicing how to identify important papers, how to move them quickly, how to ensure they reached the right hands. "Compromise," Katherine repeated, the word carrying bitter understanding. Is that what you call it? Using military authority to seize civilian property? Using war as cover for personal profit? Her rifle tracked Hayes's minute adjustments perfectly, just as James had taught her. Daniel Walker, the former cavalry scout, spoke up from his position. "That's why Jim reached out to some of us," he said, his voice carrying the authority of combat experience. "Showed us proof of how certain officers were using their positions to build private empires, how they were planning to maintain that power after the war." The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching rain, and Katherine automatically adjusted her calculations for the changing conditions, just as James had drilled into her. "The ambush that killed him," she said, watching Hayes's reaction. "It wasn't random raiders, was it?" Hayes's expression hardened. "He was getting careless," he replied, professional assessment mixing with what might have been regret. "Moving documents between safe houses, building a network of witnesses. Had to be stopped before he destabilized everything we'd built." Marcus Cole's face showed growing realization that he and his brother had been used as mere cover for a military operation. "This ain't about robbery," he said, his voice carrying dawning understanding. "This is about killing witnesses, ain't it? Making it look like random violence?" Katherine's next words carried the weight of months of preparation. "Jim knew they'd try to silence him," she explained, her rifle never wavering. "That's why he spread the evidence so widely, why he trained me so thoroughly, why he helped establish this network of defenders." Thomas Chen, the former Army sharpshooter, maintained his precise aim while adding, "Each of us holds pieces of the truth. Each property Jim helped fortify contains evidence. You can't bury this with one raid or one convenient accident." The Watson twins exchanged glances that spoke of military experience, recognizing a tactically impossible situation. Their expertise told them that this wasn't just about superior numbers or defensive positions. It was about a carefully constructed system designed to protect and perpetuate the truth. "He trained me," Katherine continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it, "not just to defend this property, but to ensure his evidence would survive. Every shooting lesson, every tactical exercise, every defensive preparation, it was all about protecting the truth he died for." Hayes's military bearing showed the slightest crack as he processed the full implications. "The raids on other homesteads," he said slowly. "They've been leading us in circles. Each property we search has just enough hints to suggest the documents might be there, but never the full evidence." "Jim called it tactical misdirection," Katherine confirmed, allowing a hint of pride to color her voice. "Said the best defense isn't just about stopping an enemy. It's about making them waste resources, chasing shadows while the truth spreads beyond their reach." Rebecca shifted slightly at her post, remembering all the rides she'd made to neighboring farms, carrying what had seemed like innocent letters, but now revealed their true purpose. The girl understood that she'd been part of Jim's network all along, helping to ensure that his evidence couldn't be silenced by a single action. Lieutenant Hayes's military experience showed in how he processed his deteriorating tactical situation. His forces were effectively neutralized, his mission compromised, and his target had revealed itself to be far more formidable than anticipated. Yet his hand still hovered near his weapon, suggesting one final decision remained to be made. "You know what Jim always said about desperate men?" Katherine asked, her rifle remaining perfectly steady. "He said they're most dangerous when they realize they've lost everything but their ability to cause harm." Her words carried the weight of careful training and bitter experience. Hayes's response came with explosive suddenness. His cavalry training showed in the fluid motion that brought his weapon up, but Katherine had been prepared for exactly this moment. Her shot cracked out before he could level his aim, striking his revolver with surgical precision and sending it spinning into the dirt. The Watson twins moved with coordinated military precision, but Katherine's defenders had anticipated this. 2. Multiple shots from different positions forced them apart, their practiced flanking maneuver disrupted by carefully planned fields of fire. Each defender's position had been chosen specifically to counter standard cavalry tactics. "Pattern 7, Katherine called out calmly, initiating a defensive sequence that James had designed specifically for this type of situation. Her defenders responded instantly, their coordinated fire forcing Hayes and his men into increasingly disadvantageous positions. Inside the house, Rebecca maintained her stance exactly as Mrs. Mills had taught her, understanding now why they had practiced these specific scenarios so many times. The girls' Springfield covered her assigned sector with unwavering precision, just one part of the interlocking defensive network. Marcus Cole made a desperate play for his dropped Spencer carbine, but 3 simultaneous shots kicked up dirt in a precise pattern around the weapon, demonstrating the futility of the attempt. "That's called preventive fire," Katherine explained, her voice carrying the same instructional tone James had used, another technique Jim adapted from his Marine training. Hayes, his primary weapon lost, but his tactical mind still working, reached for a hidden derringer in his boot. Katherine's next shot struck the ground so close to his hand that he froze, mid-motion. "Left boot holster," she commented. "Standard cavalry officer's backup position. Jim made sure I knew all of them." "Thomas," she called to Chen, "demonstrate that ricochet shot we practiced." And D, the former Army sharpshooter, responded immediately, his bullet striking a carefully angled fence post and changing direction to land precisely between the Watson twins, forcing them further apart. The autumn sun had reached the exact position Katherine's forces had prepared for, its angle creating harsh shadows that worked against any attempt to regroup or counterattack. Even the natural light had been incorporated into their defensive planning, another layer of tactical consideration that spoke of thorough military preparation. "You're probably wondering how many more defensive measures we have prepared," Katherine addressed Hayes, maintaining both tactical and psychological pressure. "How many more tricks Jim taught us? How many more ways this situation can go wrong for you?" Her rifle tracked his subtle movements with unwavering precision. The Watson twins, their military experience telling them exactly how compromised their position was, began showing signs of surrendering. Their coordinated movements had been systematically countered, their tactical advantages neutralized by superior preparation and positioning. "Michael," Katherine called to Thompson, "signal pattern 4. D, the former artillery sergeant's whistle blast carried a complex series of commands that had Katherine's defenders shifting positions in perfect coordination, further tightening their control of the tactical situation. Hayes watched his carefully, planned operation completely unravel, his professional assessment telling him exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. "Jim always said you were a quick study," he admitted, his tone carrying grudging respect beneath its bitterness. "Said you took to tactical thinking like you were born to it." "He taught me more than just shooting," Katherine replied, her aim never wavering. "He taught me to think like someone trying to attack this position, to prepare not just for the obvious threats, but for experienced military opposition, to be ready for men like you who think they can bury the truth with violence." The Cole brothers, watching their role as simple bandits transform into something far more dangerous, showed clear signs of wanting to surrender. Thomas's hands shook visibly as he slowly placed his stolen cavalry revolver on the ground, while Marcus remained frozen in place, unwilling to risk any movement that might trigger the defenders' coordinated response. "Last chance, Lieutenant," Katherine announced, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Surrender now, face proper military justice for what happened to Jim and all the others, or find out just how many more defensive measures we have prepared. Your choice, but I suggest you remember that every single person holding a rifle on you right now has combat experience and personal reasons to see justice done. The tension in the autumn air shifted as Lieutenant Hayes slowly raised his hands, his military bearing remaining dignified even in surrender. Katherine maintained her rifle's position, remembering James's lessons about how the moments following a confrontation could be just as dangerous as the conflict itself. "Daniel," she called out to the former cavalry scout, "implement security. Protocol 3. Walker responded immediately, coordinating with other defenders to begin a systematic approach to securing weapons and prisoners. Their movements showed the same precision that had marked their defense, each step carefully planned and repeatedly practiced. "Mrs. Mills," Rebecca called from her position inside the house, maintaining proper tactical protocol even as the situation evolved. Riders approaching from the south road, moving in standard cavalry formation. The girl's trained eye for military movement patterns proved its worth once again. Katherine's defensive network responded smoothly to this new development, adjusting positions to cover both the existing threats and potential new ones. But she recognized the approaching riders' formation exactly as James had described it. During their lessons about friendly reinforcement patterns, "That'll be Marshal Parker's patrol," she announced, noting Hayes's subtle reaction to the name. "Another piece of Jim's planning. They've been shadowing this area for days, waiting to see where you'd surface." Her rifle remained steady, covering Hayes, while her defenders maintained control of the others. Thomas Chen efficiently collected the dropped weapons, handling each with the expertise of a seasoned soldier. The Watson twins submitted to being secured with military-grade restraints, equipment James had insisted they keep on hand for exactly this type of situation. "You planned this," Hayes said, professional appreciation mixing with resignation in his voice. "Used the Homestead as bait, knowing we'd eventually target it. Positioned the Marshal's forces to respond once we showed our hand." His tactical assessment, even in defeat, showed his military training. Katherine allowed herself a small nod of acknowledgement. "Jim taught me that the best defensive position isn't just about repelling attacks. It's about creating a situation where you can achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Defend the homestead, expose the conspiracy, and ensure proper authorities are present to handle the aftermath." Marshal Parker's patrol emerged from the tree line in perfect military formation, their approach demonstrating the discipline of experienced cavalry troops. Katherine recognized several faces among them, more veterans who had been part of Jim's network, men who understood the importance of what they were protecting. "Samuel," Katherine addressed Rodriguez, "signal pattern 5. The former scout's whistle communication quickly coordinated the integration of the Marshal's forces with the existing defensive positions, maintaining tactical control of the situation through the transition. Inside the house, Rebecca began the careful process of retrieving the documentation they had prepared, not just evidence of the original conspiracy, but detailed records of this entire operation. James had insisted on maintaining precise documentation, understanding that proper military justice required more than just armed response. "The Cole brothers," Katherine announced, addressing Marshal Parker as his men secured the perimeter, "were hired as cover for a military operation. The Watson twins are former cavalry, working under Lieutenant Hayes's command, all part of a larger conspiracy to silence witnesses and destroy evidence of wartime corruption." Parker, a veteran officer whose reputation for integrity had survived, the war intact, nodded grimly. "We've been building this case for months," he confirmed. Jim's evidence was just the beginning. Each raid on a homestead, each attempt to silence witnesses, added to the documentation of ongoing criminal activity by former officers. Marcus Cole, watching the military precision with which his captors operated finally broke his silence. "We were just supposed to make it look like random bandit activity," he admitted, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Didn't know we were part of something this big." The Watson twins exchanged glances that spoke of military men accepting the consequences of their actions. Their training had taught them to recognize when a position was truly lost, when resistance would only make things worse. "Lieutenant Hayes," Marshal Parker addressed the captured officer formally, "you're under military arrest for conspiracy, murder, and multiple violations of military law. The civilian charges will be handled separately." His tone carried the weight of official authority, marking the transition from tactical situation to legal procedure. Katherine maintained her defensive position as the prisoners were secured, remembering James's lessons about maintaining vigilance until a situation was fully resolved. Her defenders showed the same discipline, their positions shifting to support the marshal's men while maintaining tactical control of the area. "Mrs. Mills," Parker continued, professional respect evident in his voice, "we'll need your detailed testimony about this operation. Jim's documentation suggested you were maintaining comprehensive records of their activities in this region." His words confirmed that this confrontation had been part of a larger strategy, just as James had planned. As Marshal Parker's men secured the prisoners for transport, the full impact of the day's events began to ripple through the surrounding territory. Katherine watched from her defensive position as more riders approached. Homesteaders, ranchers, and townspeople who had been part of Jim's broader network, each bringing news of similar confrontations playing out across the region. 4 more attempts on protected homesteads, Daniel Walker reported, maintaining military precision in his assessment. All repelled using the defensive tactics Jim designed. Hayes's operation wasn't just focused here, they were trying to eliminate multiple evidence caches simultaneously. Katherine nodded, remembering James's insistence on redundancy in their preparations. He always said that proper tactical planning isn't just about winning one confrontation, it's about securing lasting victory. That's why he spread the network so wide, trained so many people. Inside the house, Rebecca organized the documentation with the same careful attention to detail Mrs. Mills had instilled in her. Each piece of evidence, each record of suspicious activity, each testimony from witnesses, all catalogued with military precision, creating an undeniable pattern of corruption and attempted cover-ups. "Your husband," Marshal Parker observed, examining the detailed records, he didn't just create a defensive network, he built an entire system for exposing and documenting criminal activities by former officers. These records will shake the territorial leadership to its foundations. Thomas Chen, still maintaining his assigned observation post, reported movement from the direction of Carson's Creek. "Military precision in their approach," he noted professionally. "More veterans coming to reinforce our position." His assessment proved accurate as additional members of their network arrived, each bringing reports of successful defensive actions across the territory. "You're probably realizing now," Katherine addressed Hayes, who watched the growing assembly with grim understanding, why Jim insisted on such thorough preparation. This wasn't just about protecting one homestead or preserving one set of documents. It was about creating something that could stand against systematic corruption. The Watson twins, their military background evident in how they assessed the situation, seemed to grasp the full scope of what they'd been fighting against. "We thought we were maintaining necessary order," one of them admitted. "Didn't realize we were just helping cover up crimes." Samuel Rodriguez returned from his scouting patrol with additional intelligence. 3 more groups of raiders turned back from protected properties, he reported, words spreading about today's events. The entire defensive network is fully activated. Katherine's mind went to the countless hours spent preparing for this moment. James had insisted on establishing multiple layers of communication, ensuring that when action finally came, it would be coordinated across the entire territory. Jim called it strategic cascade, she explained to Marshal Parker. Once, one position was tested, the entire network would respond in coordination. More riders arrived, bringing news that transformed the day's victory from a single successful defense into something far more significant. Judge Harrison, known for his integrity, had issued warrants for several prominent territorial officials. Based on evidence secured through the network, Sheriff Tanner had mobilized deputies to protect key witnesses who were now coming forward with their own testimony. "Michael," Katherine called to Thompson, "signal pattern 8. The former artillery sergeant's whistle communications coordinated the integration of new arrivals into their defensive perimeter, maintaining tactical control even as their numbers grew. The precision of their response demonstrated how thoroughly James's training had prepared them for every contingency. Marcus Cole, watching the assembly of military veterans and trained civilians, finally understood the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. "This ain't just about some documents," he said slowly. "This is a whole uprising against corrupt leadership." "Not an uprising," Katherine corrected, her voice carrying the same steady authority James had used when explaining important principles. "This is the proper military and civilian authority asserting itself against criminal activity. Every person here understands the difference between revolution and restoration of legitimate order." Rebecca emerged from the house, carrying carefully organized files, each one documenting specific instances of corruption and attempted cover-ups. The girls' methodical approach to handling sensitive information showed how thoroughly she had absorbed Katherine's training. "Mrs. Mills," Marshal Parker said, examining the first set of documents, "these records aren't just evidence of past crimes. They document an ongoing pattern of corruption that extends to the highest levels of territorial government. Jim's network hasn't just been playing defense. It's been building a comprehensive case for systematic reform." Katherine nodded, remembering long discussions with James about the true purpose of their preparations. He understood that real change requires more than just exposing past crimes. It needs a network of trained, coordinated people ready to implement proper authority once the corruption is revealed. The days following the confrontation brought profound changes to the territory, each development validating James's careful planning. Katherine's homestead, still maintained with military precision, became a gathering point for territorial officials working to implement systematic reforms. The defensive positions remained manned, though now they protected witnesses coming forward with additional evidence. 6 more former officers have surrendered, Daniel Walker reported, maintaining the precise documentation protocols Katherine had established, all of them involved in Hayes's operation, all realizing the network has enough evidence to convict them. His military training showed in the methodical way he catalogued each development. Katherine watched from her porch as Marshal Parker's men coordinated with local veterans to establish proper security procedures throughout the region. The defensive techniques James had developed were being adapted for official use, transforming private preparation into institutional methodology. "What you and Jim created here," Marshal Parker observed, reviewing the latest reports, "it's becoming a model for territorial law enforcement. The combination of military precision with civilian oversight, it's exactly what these territories need to establish proper order." Inside the house, Rebecca continued her work, organizing the flood of new documentation, each piece carefully categorized according to the system Katherine had taught her. The girl's growing expertise reflected how thoroughly James's methods had been transmitted to the next generation. Thomas, Katherine called to Chen, who was training a group of deputies in proper observation techniques. Demonstrate that range estimation method Jim developed. Ditas, the former sharpshooter, proceeded to show how military precision could be adapted for civilian law enforcement, teaching skills that would help maintain order long after the immediate crisis passed. Judge Harrison arrived with news that further validated their efforts. The territorial governor has authorized a complete review of all land transactions since the war, he announced, his judicial authority now backed by proper military support. Every piece of evidence your network preserved will be examined by a formal inquiry. Katherine remembered James's insistence on maintaining perfect records, his understanding that military precision applied to documentation as well as tactics. He always said that lasting change requires more than just winning battles, she told the judge. It needs a foundation of irrefutable evidence and proper procedure. Samuel Rodriguez returned from another patrol, his report demonstrating how quickly their defensive methods were being institutionalized. 3 more counties have adopted the training protocols, he noted. Local sheriffs are implementing Jim's system for coordinating civilian and military resources. The transformation extended beyond just law enforcement. Veterans who had been part of their network were being appointed to official positions, their military experience now properly channeled into maintaining legitimate authority rather than covering up corruption. Mrs. Mills, a young deputy, approached, carrying himself with newly learned precision. Could you explain again how Mr. Mills adapted military communication protocols for civilian use? The new territorial rangers want to implement his signal system. Katherine spent the afternoon demonstrating the techniques James had developed, showing how military efficiency could serve civilian needs without compromising democratic principles. Each lesson carried forward her husband's vision of proper authority properly exercised. You've created something remarkable, Marshal Parker commented, watching the training session. These methods, this combination of military discipline and civilian oversight, it's changing how we think about maintaining order in the territories. Michael Thompson, working with another group of deputies, implemented the same rigorous standards that had served them during the confrontation. Jim always said that proper training isn't just about learning techniques, he explained to his students. It's about understanding the principles behind them. The Watson twins, now cooperating with authorities, provided valuable insights into how Hayes's corruption network had operated. Their military expertise, once used to conceal crimes, now helped expose and dismantle similar operations across the territory. Your husband, Judge Harrison said to Katherine during a quiet moment, he understood something crucial. He saw that the territories needed more than just law enforcement. They needed a systematic approach to maintaining justice, one that combined military efficiency with civilian values. Katherine nodded, remembering James's passionate belief in this principle. He used to say that military precision without proper oversight leads to corruption, but civilian authority without proper training can't maintain order. The key is finding the right balance. Rebecca, having completed another session of document organization, demonstrated this balance in action. Her methodical approach showed military precision, but her understanding of why each piece mattered reflected proper civilian priorities. She represented the future James had envisioned, skilled, disciplined, but firmly grounded in proper authority. The territorial legislature has approved funding, Marshal Parker announced, reviewing a fresh dispatch, to establish training centers based on your model. They want to implement these methods across all Western territories. His words confirmed that their local victory was transforming into systematic change. 5 years after the confrontation that exposed Hayes's corruption network, Katherine Mills stood on her porch, watching a new group of territorial rangers receiving training in the expanded practice yard. Her homestead had transformed from a single defensive position into the territory's premier training facility, though it maintained the same military precision that James had originally instilled. "Range estimation drill complete, Mrs. Mills," Rebecca called out, now a full instructor, herself at 21. The young woman had grown into her role with the same methodical dedication that Katherine had shown years before, all trainees achieving 90% accuracy at standard distances. Katherine nodded approvingly, noting how the training protocols she and James had developed had been refined and standardized without losing their essential military precision. "Jim always said that proper training isn't just about hitting targets," she told the assembled rangers. "It's about understanding why each skill matters in maintaining proper order." Marshal Parker, arriving for his monthly inspection, dismounted with the same military bearing that had marked his arrival 5 years ago. "The new territorial governor wants to expand the program," he announced, approaching the porch. 3 more training facilities being established, all based on your model." Inside the converted barn, Daniel Walker supervised advanced tactical instruction, teaching the same defensive principles that had proven so effective during the Hayes confrontation. The facility had grown, but its core purpose remained unchanged. Transforming military expertise into proper civilian protection. "Thomas," Katherine called to Chen, who was demonstrating precision shooting techniques, "show them that wind-reading method Jim developed." The former sharpshooter's demonstration reflected how military skills had been successfully adapted for law enforcement purposes, maintaining effectiveness while serving civilian authority. The homestead itself stood as a testament to proper evolution. While it retained all its defensive capabilities, it had grown to include classroom spaces, training ranges, and documentation centers. Each addition reflected the same careful planning that had marked the original design. "You've created something unique," Judge Harrison observed during his quarterly review. "This isn't just a training facility. It's a model for how territories can maintain order while respecting proper authority." His judicial perspective appreciated how military precision had been properly channeled into civilian law enforcement. Samuel Rodriguez, now chief instructor for scout training, returned from leading a field exercise. "The new patrol protocols are working exactly as designed," he reported with military efficiency. 3 more attempted land grabs prevented this month alone, all through proper legal channels. Katherine's mind went to those early days with James, learning not just shooting techniques, but the principles behind them. He understood that lasting change requires more than just skilled individuals, she told the judge. It needs systematic implementation of proper methods. The Watson twins, having served their sentences, had become valuable instructors in the program. Their military experience, combined with their first-hand knowledge of how corruption operated, helped trainees understand both the technical and ethical aspects of their duties. "Your advanced classes," Marshal Parker noted, reviewing the latest training reports, "they're not just producing better law enforcement officers. They're creating leaders who understand how to maintain order while preventing abuse of authority." His words validated James's original vision. Michael Thompson, working with a group of advanced students, implemented the same rigorous standards that had proven so effective years before. "Pattern recognition in routine patrols," he explained, demonstrating how military observation techniques could serve civilian peacekeeping. "Mrs. Mills," a young ranger approached, her bearing showing the results of proper training. "Could you explain again how Mr. Mills adapted military unit coordination for civilian use? We're implementing the system in the Northern Territories." Katherine spent the afternoon sharing James's insights, showing how military precision could serve democratic principles when properly applied. Each lesson carried forward his vision of skilled, disciplined peacekeepers, firmly grounded in proper authority. 5 years, Rebecca mused during a quiet moment, organizing the next day's training schedule with characteristic precision. Sometimes, it's hard to believe how much has changed since that day. Her methodical approach to administration reflected how thoroughly she had absorbed both the technical and philosophical aspects of their mission. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the training yard, where another group of rangers practiced. Coordinated movement patterns. Their exercises demonstrated how James's military expertise had been successfully translated into civilian law enforcement procedures without losing its essential effectiveness. "Your husband would be proud," Marshal Parker said, watching the training sessions. "This is exactly what he envisioned. Military precision serving proper authority, maintaining order while preventing the abuse of power." His words acknowledged how completely James's vision had been realized. Katherine nodded, remembering those long training sessions where James had shared not just his skills, but his dreams for the territory's future. "He always said that the true test of any system isn't just how well it works today," she replied, "but how effectively it trains tomorrow's protectors." 10 years after the confrontation that changed the territory forever, Katherine Mills stood in her expanded training facility's main hall, examining the framed photograph of James in his Marine dress uniform. The facility had grown far beyond its origins as a homestead defense, becoming the model for law enforcement training across the Western Territories, though it maintained the same military precision that had marked its beginnings. "Final graduation class of the year assembled, Mrs. Mills," Rebecca announced, now the facility's chief instructor and Katherine's right hand. The young woman's bearing reflected the perfect blend of military discipline and civilian authority that had become their hallmark. 38 new rangers, all meeting the standards Mr. Mills established. Katherine moved to address the graduating class, her steps carrying the same measured precision James had taught her so long ago. The assembly included not just territorial rangers, but officials from eastern states, all seeking to understand and implement what had become known as the Mills method of integrated civilian military law enforcement. "A decade ago," Katherine began, her voice carrying the same steady authority that had faced down Hayes and his men, "my husband understood something crucial about maintaining order in these territories. He saw that we needed more than just skilled shooters or stern lawmen. We needed protectors who understood both military precision and civilian responsibility." Marshal Parker, now Territory Chief Marshal, stood nearby, his presence a testament to how completely the system had been transformed. "The Mills training program has become the standard across all Western Territories," he announced to the assembled graduates. "Every ranger, every sheriff, every deputy now learns these methods. Daniel Walker, supervising the advanced tactical program, had maintained the same military precision in training that had served them during the Hayes confrontation. "Show them the modified range estimation technique," Katherine called to him, watching as he demonstrated how James's military expertise had been perfectly adapted for civilian law enforcement. Inside the documentation center, a team of clerks maintained records with the same meticulous care that had helped expose Hayes's corruption network. Each piece of evidence, each report, each training record was preserved with military precision, creating an unbroken chain of proper authority and accountability. "Your husband's vision," Judge Harrison observed during the graduation ceremony, "it's done more than just improve law enforcement. It's changed how we think about authority itself in these territories." His words acknowledged how completely James's principles had been integrated into the region's governance. The Watson twins, having become respected training officers after serving their sentences, demonstrated advanced tactical procedures to visiting officials. Their military expertise, once misused, now served to show how proper training could prevent the abuse of power they had once participated in. "Tell them about the signal system," Katherine instructed Michael Thompson, who now headed the Communications Training Division. The former artillery sergeant showed how military coordination protocols had been adapted for civilian use, maintaining effectiveness while serving proper authority. Samuel Rodriguez, leading the Scout training program, returned from a field exercise with the latest statistics. Territorial crime rates down 70% since implementation of the Mills method, he reported with characteristic precision. Land fraud cases nearly eliminated through preventive protocols. Katherine's mind went to those early days, with James learning not just marksmanship, but the principles that would transform an entire territory. He believed that proper training wasn't just about teaching skills, she told the graduates. It was about instilling understanding of why those skills matter and how they serve legitimate authority. Rebecca, standing with her own group of trainees, embodied the program's success. From a young girl learning to handle documents, she had grown into an instructor who understood both the technical and ethical aspects of their mission. She represented the next generation of leaders James had envisioned. "Mrs. Mills," a young ranger approached after the ceremony, "is it true that you single-handedly held off Hayes and his entire gang?" The question brought a slight smile to Katherine's face. "No victory is truly single-handed," she corrected, maintaining the precision in thinking that James had taught her. That day succeeded because of proper preparation, coordinated response, and every person understanding their role in maintaining legitimate authority. As the sun set on another training day, Katherine stood on her expanded porch watching the next generation of territorial rangers practicing the skills that would help maintain proper order. The homestead had grown, but it retained every defensive feature James had designed, now serving as practical examples for trainees. "Your husband," Marshal Parker said, joining her on the porch. "He didn't just create a training program. He established a legacy that will shape these territories for generations." His words acknowledged how completely James's vision had been realized. Katherine nodded, remembering those long-ago training sessions where James had shared not just his military expertise, but his dreams for the territory's future. His vision had grown from protecting one homestead to transforming how authority itself was maintained across the entire region. "Jim always said that true security isn't just about having the fastest draw or the steadiest aim," she told Parker, watching the trainees practice their drills with perfect precision. "It's about building something that lasts, something that protects not just property, but principles." As darkness settled over the training facility, Katherine Mills reflected on how far they had come from that autumn day when Hayes and his men had mistaken her for an easy target. The legacy of a Marine Scout sniper's expertise, transformed through his wife's dedication and spread through their trainees, had become a permanent foundation for proper authority in the American West. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.